This is a truly impressive panel of all leaders on all fronts of education, reform, and public service, and I'm really looking forward to this discussion and perhaps a debate. Quickly on this New Dominion project, when I ran for Lieutenant Governor in 2009, I think anybody who has run for office or people who know people who run for office, what sticks with you at the end of a campaign is not the 30 or 40 hours a week you spent raising money or the long hours in the car. It tends to not even be the things that are really about yourself. It's the people and the stories and the ideas that you came away with. And what was so incredible to me as I traveled the Commonwealth was I really did discover a new Dominion that was not being represented to me in a lot of what I was hearing, certainly by the people who won that year in 2009. And we've seen that even worse in 2010 and 2011. And I find it plainly, simply infuriating and frustrating that Ken Cuccinelli has come somehow to represent the Commonwealth of Virginia to the country. And so I started this political action committee with a bunch of Democratic and progressive leaders around the Commonwealth, including a number here in Arlington, Margot Horner and Marge Epstein and Maureen Markham and Mark Signer and Mike Lieberman are all on the steering committee of it, to paint a different Virginia for ourselves, for the country, for the Democratic Party on both ideas and emotion and narratives, and to show the new Dominion that actually exists. I think we might all agree that sometimes Democrats don't do the best job of creating narratives that are extremely compelling. Our ideas are great, but sometimes we do need a little bit of help internally, and so that's what this project really has been intended to do. And why have we talked about education now? Last year we focused on telling stories, which was kind of a version of NPR's StoryCorps for Virginia. This year we have focused on policy and ideas and framing big principles because the Democratic Party of Virginia doesn't really have a platform right now. And why education? We are in time when government itself, per se, is under attack by a vast right-wing conspiracy. How else could you describe it? Education is the most critical, sympathetic interaction of many people with their government. It is truly a core service. Democrats in Virginia win when they stay on the offense on public education. We look back at Chuck Robb, to Doug Wilder, to Mark Warner, to Tim Kaine for ample examples of that fact. And for me, this is very personal. I grew up in Arlington and was blessed to go to Key Elementary School and H.B. Woodlawn for middle school and Washington Lee. And I went to, I still remember when I did a Virginia's governor's school at the University of Richmond in high school, they asked us to bring down the most influential teacher we had ever had. And I brought down John Durr, who taught me from 3rd to 6th grades at Key Elementary. And it was very moving for him and for me. And a truly great teacher can make a huge impact on the entire rest of your life. We did a panel on higher ed reform ideas last week in Richmond, 2 weeks ago in Richmond. Dak Hardwick actually was on the panel representing the public sector, the private sector, and now we're turning to K through 12. There's a copy of our strategy paper, which includes a variety of principles that drive specific policies. I will survey them very quickly. They're for teacher excellence, expanding opportunity and choice, innovating and striving, and beginning early to connect with higher ed and workforce development. That is a framework of ideas. As any lawyer in the room knows, you can get very powerful conclusions from first principles. And we do need first principles in place as Democrats and progressives. And there are some very bold policies that follow from those principles, including working on the so-called tenure problem by creating a cadre of board-certified Virginia teachers, expanding magnet schools across Virginia, focusing on social and economic and emotional learning, and expanding STEM education. Our panelists will talk more about those specific ideas. I'm going to give their bios quickly all at once so that then we can get to their remarks. Abby Raphael is the chair of the Arlington County School Board, as you all know. As a member of the board, she served as the liaison to the Partnership for Children, Youth and Families, the Student Advisory Board, and the Washington Area Boards of Education, and she's been a member of the county strategic issue team on youth binge drinking. She also serves on the board of directors of the Arlington YMCA. A former assistant Commonwealth attorney in Arlington, she earned her JD from the University of Virginia School of Law and her BA from Duke. And she's lived in Arlington since 1989. She and her husband Stuart have 2 daughters who attend Williamsburg and WL. Dr. Kitty Boynott is the president of the Virginia Education Association. She has worked in public education for 37 years. Most of her career was spent as an elementary school librarian, although she has experience teaching 6th grade language arts. She spent a lot of her career in Roanoke County schools, but from 2001 to 2008, she worked for the Henrico County public school system. She's currently on a leave of absence from there while she serves as the full-time president of the VEA, which is the largest organization representing teachers and support professionals in Virginia. She has a BA from Longwood, an MA from Hollins, an education science from UVA, and a PhD in educational leadership from VCU. And she's a national board certified teacher, and she's in the year of her final term as president of the VA. Andy Rotherham is partner at Bellwether Education Partners. He's a co-founder and partner there, which is a nonprofit organization working to improve educational outcomes for low-income students. He leads Bellwether's thought leadership, idea generation, and policy analysis, and he also writes the weekly School for Thought column in Time Magazine, which probably some of you know, as well as the blog EduWonk, and he publishes Education Insider, which is a federal policy research tool. And he previously served at the White House as Special Assistant to President Clinton for Domestic Policy, and as a former member of the Virginia Board of Education, and he has founded or co-founded 2 other influential education reform organizations and serves on several boards. And finally, not least, Dimitri Melhorn is Chief Operating Officer for Students First. He's on leave from his position on the executive team of a global software and services firm. Previously, he served as the Chief of Staff and a practicing antitrust counsel at a global law firm. He was born in Oakland, California, and began his career as a debate instructor at public high school, published articles on legal issues and economics and technologies, graduate from Stanford, Harvard University, and Yale Law School, which is very impressive, and he used to live in Arlington. And Andy lives in Arlington as well with his wife and 2 daughters. So I will shut up now and turn over our panel to these very impressive folks, and I think we will just have you come up here, unless we can figure out how to use these microphones right here. Let's go down.
Well, thanks very much to Mike for organizing this, and it's a real honor to be part of this panel. The premise of this strategy paper is that there is a real urgency in Virginia for school reform so that students across the state can succeed. And even though Arlington, as you know, is considered one of the best school districts in the country, we have that same sense of urgency here to make sure we're doing everything that we can to make sure that all of our students are succeeding. And what I thought I'd do tonight is just touch on some of the things that we think at the local level are working here, and then we'll get the more statewide and national perspective from the other panelists. So one of the points in the strategy paper is beginning to connect early students with higher education. And in Arlington, we think that education is a continuum from pre-K through 16. So it's starting with that investment in early childhood and pre-K education, and then preparing students as they go through school so that by the time they graduate, they are ready for the workforce and they're ready to succeed in college. We know the importance of pre-K, and we really invest in that in Arlington. At the middle school level, we have a focus on students completing Algebra 1 in middle school and also starting foreign languages. And the research shows, and our own studies show, that students who complete Algebra 1 in middle school are much more likely to graduate on time. So that's one of the benchmarks we look at. We have a real focus on rigor and making sure that our students are challenged and engaged. That's the first point of our strategic plan. So we have a real emphasis on encouraging students to take, for example, AP and IB courses, and also to take dual enrollment courses. And we hear a lot about STEM education, science, technology, engineering, and math. We know how important that is, that hands-on learning and that integrated learning. We have a career center that does that. We have that in many of our courses throughout the school system. But interestingly, we have an elementary school that starting next year is going to be a STEM elementary school, Hoffman, Boston. And that's a school that had some challenges, and we thought that one of the ways to really improve achievement at that school was to turn that into a STEM education school. Teacher excellence is another point that the paper talks about, and we all know that quality teachers are what really make the difference for student success. So another one of our strategic plan goals is recruiting and retaining and developing quality teachers. And that's not just about compensation. That's a big point, and I'll talk about that. But it's a lot of other factors as well. So professional development is something that we really invest in. And having targeted professional development so that within each school building, we're focusing on what those students need at that school and helping teachers to get the additional skills and knowledge that they need. In addition, things like class size and benefits and the work environment are so important. We just had a meeting, in fact, before I came over here with our different employee groups as part of the budget process and hearing from them about what they need and what will help keep them teaching in Arlington. Compensation is very important, and in Arlington we strive to be either at the top or very near the top in the pay scale, because it's a very competitive area and we want those top quality teachers in front of our students every single day. You may have seen there was an article that Joel Klein published in the Washington Post over the weekend, and he talked about the real difficulty in this country about how we think about teachers, and really what he called it the professionalizing teaching. And that in other countries, teachers come from the very top universities, they're the cream of the crop, and what can we do as a nation to encourage more of our top folks to go into teaching and to continue that great profession. Now, in terms of results, first let me just tell you a little bit about Arlington for those who don't know some of the demographics. We don't have any majority population of students. We're 46.5% white, 27.8% Hispanic, 11% African American, and about 31% free and reduced lunch. We have students who speak about 98 languages, so we are a very diverse community. And because this community believes in investing in education, we have tremendous resources, so we're able to do all the things that I was talking about. As a result, we see wonderful achievement among our students. I was just over at Washington Lee High School. The auditorium was filled with students who have been nationally recognized for their art. Just a tremendous achievement by our students. On Sunday, we had an auditorium full of students at Wakefield High School for the regional science fair, and students moving on to the national level. You know, demonstrating their creativity and their innovation and their real love of learning. So it's not all about test scores if we want to measure our students' success. But there are some scores and some percentages. So our on-time graduation rate is 87.5% for all of our students last year, and at each of our comprehensive high schools it was better than 90%. So we see great results, but despite that, we still have an achievement gap. And so in things like rigor, encouraging students to take these advanced level courses, we are not where we want to be. And in terms of standard diploma versus advanced diploma, standard diploma is, you graduate and that's a fine accomplishment, but the advanced studies diploma is what really opens the doors for students for future opportunity. We have significant gaps in that in Arlington, so that's something that we're continuing to focus on. I'm sure folks are going to be talking about resources. Like I said, this community invests in education. I was meeting with students, I was reading to fifth graders the other day at a school, and I looked at them and I said, we spend more than $18,000 on each and every one of you, and their jaws dropped, and it was amazing to them. So we invest. Other jurisdictions, I was looking at Martinsville, just as an example, $10,000 a student there. Average teacher salary in Martinsville, $49,000. Average teacher salary in Arlington, $73,000. So there is a huge disparity, and I, for one, feel very fortunate to work in a community that has the resources and chooses to invest them in education so that we can do what we are doing for our students. Thank you.
Good evening. It's a huge pleasure to be here with you this evening. I'd like to start out by offering an amendment to the white paper that was submitted for tonight's discussion. The amendment would be in principle number 1 on teacher excellence, and I would like to offer the words "in school" to be inserted in the first sentence between the words "important" and "factor." I don't disagree with the assertion that teacher excellence is the most important in-school factor in children's academic achievement. But to omit that qualifier ignores the far more important and pervasive factors that impact academic achievement, which are parental involvement and support, as well as the nature of the community as it relates to the child's socioeconomic background and status. Education reformers all too often myopically focus on the school instead of the macrocosmic community of which the school is representative. It is a convenience to ignore the impact of poverty, for example, but it is not helpful. It is convenient to ignore that some of our students show up at school every morning hungry, in need of glasses or appropriate dental care, or even proper clothing. But we ignore those factors at the risk of making the teacher accountable for factors over which he or she has absolutely no control. Teachers can only deal with the students who show up where they are at any given point in time. A child who has been read to from cradle to kindergarten, one who has been conversed with by the significant adults in his or her life, one who has done some traveling outside of his or her neighborhood, and one who has had the benefit of a preschool experience, are light years ahead of those who show up on the first day of kindergarten, not having developed appropriate verbal skills, knowledge of colors, shapes, or numbers, and haven't been exposed to, in any meaningful way, to the power of the written word. Holding teachers accountable for that achievement gap is clear and present before they ever get started is not only unfair, it is absurd. That teachers do have control over, most of them would agree, I believe, that education, experience, and feedback are critical to their success in the classroom. We would agree that our school system should enact effective programs for developing great teachers. But we would like to have a say as to what those programs entail. And right now we seem to be the last group that anyone is consulting as to what those programs should be. Teachers have been shut out routinely and systematically from having meaningful input into any of the reforms that have been coming out of the U.S. Department of Education or any of the think tanks and foundations that I'm aware of. And even when we are given nodding acknowledgement or we are allowed to sit at the table, it's always clear that the initiatives have already been decided upon, the direction has already been set, and the performance of having teachers sit anywhere in the room for the discussion is more for show than for offering meaningful opportunities for input. I have been struggling with the conundrum of how to include teachers' voices in the conversation for almost 30 years. I was ready to leave the profession in disgust and disillusionment in the mid-1980s until I was inspired by the vision for the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards. And I decided to stick around and become part of that movement. Of all of my various accomplishments, I am most proud of my National Board certification because it is an objective validation that I am an expert practitioner in my field. I was deemed so not by administrators who don't know much about my field, in order to promote much about my field, but by my colleagues and my peers. We should be doing more to promote the National Board program in order to promote excellence in teaching and spending less time on value-added machinations and merit pay schemes. The National Board system is in place and is currently being underutilized by policymakers because it is complex as opposed to simple, and because it is controlled primarily by educators and not education reformers who are profiting off of their various and sundry schemes for reform. I look forward to the debate.
All right, thank you. It's great to be here. As Mike mentioned, I have 2 kids in Arlington Public Schools now. We, with a fabulous teacher, we're actually subtly lobbying for looping, although I don't think it's going to happen. So my remarks are actually less, and I think this could be part of the problem of the debate, like Arlington is not Virginia. And so, like, a lot of the problems that we're going to talk about, here, and I've lived in Arlington, I've actually lived in a couple other parts of the state, I've seen that. You guys see that in our politics, obviously. But But I want to talk a little about sort of what's happening statewide, which is not, I mean, Arlington has its challenges, and I thought Abby did a really nice job of sort of laying out the things that are really spectacular here and the areas of growth. So my remarks are more sort of statewide than Arlington. And here's a couple of numbers statewide that you may not hear very much because people don't like to talk about them very much. 15% of the low-income kids in the state, so that means free and reduced price lunch. That's not just acutely poor, that's low income. 15% are proficient in reading on the National Assessment of Education Progress by the time they're in 8th grade. 15%. And just full stop on that for a moment. 16% of our black kids in this state are proficient on the NAEP by the time they're in 8th grade. 16%. Full stop on that. Now, I agree that there's a lot of other factors that affect student achievement, a lot of challenges and so forth, but I would submit to you, all else equal, we can do better than those numbers right now. And so we do need to focus on those other things. I mean, I'm at Time Magazine now, so my politics are kind of in advance, but I vote like everybody else in this room. I vote for candidates who care about those things. But even when they don't win, even when those policies don't get enacted in Richmond, we can expect more from our schools. And the problem we have, we have a high school graduation rate statewide for minority kids that flirts with 70%. So 7 in 10 of our kids statewide are getting the bare minimum credential to succeed. For our overall graduation rates in the 70s. 24% of our kids need remediation when they get to college. Those who go on to 4-year colleges need remediation. 24%, that's according to Achieve, which is a national group funded by the governor's working on standards. And yet, what's our sort of big talking point, the number you always hear? More than 96% of our schools are fully accredited. I would submit to you that a system that says 96% is doing well, 15% of our low-income kids reading by 8th grade, 16% of our black kids, and by the way, the numbers in math are the same, I'm not cherry-picking it at the exact same ballpark. There's a disconnect there. And so I was excited by the paper. I didn't agree with every idea in it. I know you'll hear some disagreement. I think Demetria and I probably will disagree a little bit on the resources. I was actually surprised Abby picked Martinsville. I would have said Floyd or Giles. There's counties that actually spend a lot less than they do down in Martinsville. So I was excited by the ideas because I see sort of 3 problems that we have in this conversation. First of all, as a Commonwealth, we have prioritized looking good over doing well. We have prioritized making sure it looks like our schools are doing really well over making sure they do well. That's why people talk about 96%. They don't talk about 15%. They don't talk about 16%. Those are uncomfortable things to talk about. Second, we have some confusion about who it is that our schools serve. And you see this in our politics, you see this in our rhetoric, you see this in the things that we can talk about even in forums like this. Do our schools exist to serve the adults who work in them? Do they exist to serve the kids they're supposed to serve? And we have some confusion about that, and we should just talk honestly about that. We have spectacular teachers in this county, we have spectacular teachers in this state. It doesn't disrespect them to talk about the fact that we have a system that in some ways, though, is more oriented towards what the adults need than what the kids need. And then finally, we just don't have the urgency yet. I mean, if you look at the conversations, I think some other states actually have too much urgency. And if you read my columns in Time, you'll see I think people are sort of, we're getting farther ahead with urgency than we are with capacity to actually do it. But we have the opposite problem here. I mean, we're spending more time fighting about crazy policies on women's health, all this other stuff they're talking about in Richmond, rather than seriously improving our schools. Our governor says he's all for education, to be the education governor. He can't even put forward anything better than a really anemic charter school bill. Mike Singer's paper is more robust on charter schools than Bob McDonald, the presumed VP contender, can get done down in Richmond. There's a lack of urgency. There's a lack of urgency here. And this is a long-term problem. And if you look at our state, you look at where we live, I mean, let's be honest. The federal government is a good friend to us. It's a good friend in terms of the military. It's a good friend in terms of government, all these sort of issues that are here. If you look at the long-term trends, you know, so the counties up here, we're going to be fine. It's one of the reasons that this area is so wealthy. If you look at the long-term trends, we shouldn't be relying on the government to drive Virginia's economy over time. We should be relying on a good public school system makes us the kind of place where businesses and the private sector wants to go as well. And when you get out of that 95 corridor and Hampton Roads and so forth, you see those struggles. and you see those factories moving out, not in, and you see what's happening, particularly in the mountains and west of 81. And that's why this is a Virginia problem. We have to get serious about it in a way we haven't yet. So we can talk about the specific ideas, but I'm very excited that Mike is going around the state and doing this, and I'm excited to talk more about the paper. Thank you for having me.
Why do Democrats care so much about education? President Barack Obama, Governor Bill Clinton, President Bill Clinton, Governor Phil Bredesen, Governor Andrew Cuomo, Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa, Mayor Cory Booker. Why are all of these leaders, and more, Governor Malloy, Governor Cuomo, why are all these leaders talking about education as a civil rights issue of our generation? I think the reason is what my mom told me when I was young, when she was early in her career, which spent 35 years in public school teaching, including time as a union rep, is because she went into teaching because she wanted a society where people of all races could be equal, where interracial marriage would not even be noticed. And that's why she went into teaching. She told me that from the time I was very young. And Democrats believe in the power of progressive society to create a more just country. That's what Democrats believe. And the debate about education, there's a lot of stuff that gets thrown around. It's actually very simple. Our organization is called Students First. One of the organizations that's opposed to us is called Save Our Schools. So the debate is, are our schools basically doing okay? And there's a good argument to be made. You know, legacy of racism, poverty, social problems, given all of that, our schools are basically doing okay. Or could our schools be doing much, much better to make a more just country? And we believe our schools could be doing much, much better throughout the country, especially in among the least served communities, but even in the best served communities. And the reason we believe that is because the evidence is clear. We as a country have doubled per pupil expenditures over the past several decades. We now spend 40% more than the industrialized average. And we have bottom third results in the industrialized world. We get, according to McKinsey & Company, the consultancy, the worst return on invested dollar in the world. It's not a distinction that I like. We have an achievement gap that is outrageous. Mike's paper talks about some of it, but blacks and Hispanics and American Indians graduate roughly half of their students from high school, whereas whites graduate something like 77%. Now, we could pivot to talk about a lot of things, but the thing to understand is that it is possible to do much better. We know that. We know there are charter schools like KIPP, the Knowledge is Power program, that have 109 schools and 32,000 students. 3,200 students, 109 schools, and they do dramatically better with the same populations that we had previously written off. There's a robust debate about how well Washington, D.C. did or didn't do under my boss, former Chancellor Michelle Rhee. There's a robust debate, happy to talk about that. But there's no debate that kids from all backgrounds can learn, and do learn, and should learn, and the difference is teachers. Every country that has great schools has great teachers. Teachers that are respected, teachers that have high status, and we want that. And the question is, how do you get there? Now, I could debate some of the specifics about Mike's paper, but I want to instead key off a couple of things that Kitty said. I agree that it is absurd, and I think I'm using her word, to hold teachers accountable for things that happen outside the classroom. That is totally absurd. So absurd, in fact, that I don't know of anybody in the country who's proposed it. Our proposal, and what happens, what the debate is about value-add measures, which means that a teacher who gets a bunch of high-performing kids, and they leave as high-performing kids, that teacher is rated average. Whereas a teacher who gets a bunch of low-performing kids and moves them forward, well, that teacher is rated as exceptional. And that's the whole debate. And there's a ton of evidence that that matters. There was a recent study, I mean, the evidence from Doug Steger at Dartmouth, from Raj Chetty and Friedman from Columbia and Harvard, from Tom Kane at Harvard, from Eric Henryshek at Stanford. The evidence is overwhelming that the teachers who move kids forward do so on a consistent basis, year after year, and the teachers who don't are also consistent. It is obvious who is good, it is obvious who is not. And there's a lot of people in the middle who can be helped. But the teachers who are good should be retained. They should make a lot more money. In Washington, D.C., under Michelle, the very best teachers, starting from a $65,000 base, got $25,000 per year merit bonuses and $20,000 per year raises. That's substantial. And that's for the best teachers. And the teachers who were not able to be in front of classrooms were encouraged to move on to their next career. And that's the kind of courageous commitment that is necessary in order for us to serve all our students well.
Okay, so we're going to stay seated for the rest, try to make the most of our time. I want to do a follow-up to go through here, and then I want to open it up to questions from the audience. I think we're going until about 8:20, and Mike, just feel free to get out the hook. And before I get to that, I want to encourage everybody, our two great interns, Neil and Alex, are going to be passing up sign-up sheets after we're finished. I want to encourage everybody to sign up so we can stay in touch with you and let you know about future events like this and materials in the future, so please do sign up. I want to ask everyone here a quick follow-up, which is, and there are a couple of qualifiers in it. In the next 24 months, so a 2-year time period, what is one thing that Virginia could do as a matter of statewide policy with a 75% likelihood of actually becoming effective, taking into account every political reality, every practical reality you all know about Virginia, that would address the socioeconomic problem that every one of you just raised, which is the most intractable thing here?
Well, that's an easy question. One of the things we focused on this year, frankly, is for the state to get out of the way. There are so many mandates and the state testing and the requirements that teachers have to be doing these reports and doing all this testing. And teachers tell us, like I said, we were just meeting with them, they have more work, they have more paperwork, and less time to just teach and work with the students. So we ask our principals, the school board meets with principals, we started doing this last year. One of the questions is, what is there that we have control over that we can get out of your way? And so that you and your teachers can just teach and do what you're trained to do and what you're so good at. There's a panel right now that's working on trying to eliminate state mandates. And I'll tell you just one interesting thing too, when we think about all the time we spend on SOLs, SOL testing is not a growth model. It measures students at a certain point, 3rd grade, 5th grade. It doesn't tell us anything about how they're progressing. But the state's telling us that we have to now measure achievement as we're evaluating teachers, and they want us to use the SOLs to do it. So it just doesn't make any sense. So the state can step out of the way and let locals more establish what's going on in education.
I'm at a loss as to, I'm at a loss as to how to answer the question of anything happening in 2 years, given what I've been watching in Richmond, and I've been watching it closely every day this session. And until and unless, and Arlington is not guilty of this, so let me just say thank you for sending us the representatives that you send us. There's just not enough of them. And in other localities around the state, folks are sending people that I know they trust them to get to Richmond and do the right thing. But they're not doing the right thing. There are a lot of people who are coming to Richmond precisely to put public education on the back burner. They don't want to offer support. We're going to be operating next year on funding levels of 2007. Localities are going to be receiving less money, less financial support than they have had in 5 years. And we have more students with greater needs than we've ever had before. It's crazy. So how do you change that in 2 years? I'm not sure. We'll have an election in 2 years or another year. We need a whole new crop of folks in the General Assembly who believe, like the people in this room, I presume, do, that the state has an obligation, according to the Constitution, to provide for a high-quality education for every child in the Commonwealth. There are a lot of people in the General Assembly, I believe, who've not bothered to read that Constitution. Either they've never read it or they haven't read it in a really long time because they're ignoring that basic obligation. Apparently they don't believe that it is their obligation. So I wish I had an answer for you, Mike, but I don't.
So, I guess I would answer, that 96% figure, you're probably wondering why the disconnect and how we got there. The reason's really straightforward. Virginia's entire school accreditation system doesn't take into account things like race, or doesn't take into account things like doesn't take into account things like race, it doesn't take into account things like income, it doesn't take any of these things into account. And so that's how you can have 96% of schools looking great when minority kids and poor kids lag behind. So over the 2 years, if we're gonna have an honest conversation about our schools, and I agree with the point on spending, that we need to do more. I also agree we need to do more on the accountability front. But if we're gonna have those conversations, we gotta be able to have an honest conversation. So the thing that I would submit that we do over the next 2 years is actually have an accreditation system that doesn't just let you go school accredited for getting 70% of the kids there. And let's be honest, when you actually look at the cut scores on the SOLs, the 70% bar, it's not that demanding in terms of what it actually takes to get 70% of the kids over the bar. We actually have a meaningful bar. We disaggregate by race and income. Frankly, in a place like Arlington, that would have relatively little effect. Even our really diverse schools, like the ones that my kids go to, are pretty high performing. But in other parts of the state, that would start to show what the issue is, and then we can start to have an honest conversation about these other issues. I actually agree. We've been so inattentive for so long that we're not in a good position to evaluate our teachers, which is crazy. It is the most important thing that happens within school, and we pay no attention to it in Virginia in terms of evaluating our teachers. But the answer is not to then go to a system that we're technically unprepared to do. So we need to start being able to have these conversations, and sort of an honest framework about performance is the best way into those conversations. And I think that's actually something that it doesn't cost them money right now, so the Republicans would probably go for it, and it's a good thing for equity, and so it's like the Democrats ought to be supporting vociferously.
I unfortunately agree with my fellow panelists that 75% likelihood is tough with this government. 60 maybe. I do think election of more folks that you all support would help. I actually agree with a lot of my fellow panelists on most of this, so to keep it interesting, I'll focus on the thing I disagree with. I do think that we could just, if the stars were aligned, we could just pass a teacher evaluation reform that anchored teacher compensation and teacher professional practices to teacher effectiveness. It's something that over 31 states have done. It's something that Governor Cuomo has brokered, Governor Malloy is pushing right now to take 2 Democrats. It's something that Pat Quinn signed in Illinois to take a 3rd Democratic governor, Governor Bredesen in Tennessee to take a 4th. It is something that is doable, consistent with Democratic principles, but there are also Republicans like Haslam in Tennessee who passed something similar. So it is a bipartisan issue to simply anchor teacher effectiveness to teacher professional practices. The one thing I'm going to disagree with is this issue of resources. Virginia spends over $10,000 per pupil. That is 3 times as much as New Zealand, 3 times as much as Korea, far more than most countries that radically outperform us, including countries like when Korea essentially turned around its economy from being a poor country to becoming a rich country by reforming its schools. New Zealand has a massive achievement gap and tremendous social problems, and yet they were able to turn around their schools with 1/3 as much money as we spent. High expenditure. Detroit public schools, $15,000 per pupil. Newark, $22,000 per pupil. Spending more money doesn't help if you don't spend it properly. And by the way, across the board pay increases are not the answer. In Detroit, average teacher pay in Detroit public schools is over $70,000 a year. Average compensation for a generally employed person is $33,000 per year. with much less job security. So teachers are making 3 times as much as the general population. That should be enough for status, and yet people are not flocking to Detroit for the quality of the schools. You've got to spend the money on what matters. That means targeted at the highest performing teachers and at the most effective interventions, the most effective school models. If you spend the money in a blanket way, the money will be wasted. There is enough money in the system today if it's spent properly.
So we're passing back, we're allowed to debate. And I want to take issue with one part of this, which is the Virginia.
Yes. So I
this
think I wanted to do questions from the crowd, but I think let's do responses.
I want to take issue with one part of this because I thought it was interesting. Abby said the average salary here is $70,000, which I assume is right and makes sense. If you go an hour south here to Madison County, the top salary is $45,000. And so even accounting for the lower cost of living, and so, I mean, teachers up here, like in Northern Virginia, nobody wants to talk about this, but actually a family of 2 teachers, both with 15 years in the system, are in the upper 5% of U.S. wage earners. So that's the reality of Northern Virginia. Madison County, $45,000.
They still can't live in Arlington.
Okay, fair enough. But $45,000 in Madison County, totally insufficient. That's not the average, that's the top. And so when we get into this resource discussion, it's the variance. So it's great that Arlington spends $18,000 with a lot of these counties, what they're spending in places like Lee County and so forth. That's what we should be so focused on. So I think the general point on money is exactly right. We're not going to spend our way out of this problem, but the sort of variance that we tolerate within this Commonwealth is to use the earlier word, is completely absurd. And then on the teacher evaluations, I agree. I just want to push back. We need to evaluate our teachers, obviously, and we don't do it, but we've paid so little attention. Our principals get very little training. If you actually go through a principal training program in the state, you get trained on how to fire someone legally so you can stay out of court. But you don't actually get trained on what like really high quality personnel management, performance management, what those things look like. And so we need to move there, but we need to be, we're going to pay a price for having paid so little attention to this for so long. We need to be thoughtful about how we move there.
Okay. On the 96% and what you said earlier about we've prioritized looking good over doing well. I wouldn't disagree with that. What I would tell you is that the reason for that is that there have been so many punitive measures that have been created in order to punish those who don't try to look good. Instead of promoting experimentation and innovation and creativity, we've been locked into a lockstep box. We have to do a certain set of standards. We have to do pacing charts. We have to do whatever the central office says we have to do. If we could get away from the punitive model and actually free our teachers up to do what they know needs to be done for our students, I believe we'd be in a whole lot better shape. I don't know where you get the idea that teachers aren't evaluated. They certainly are in my district, and they were in Roanoke County where I was from. I can't imagine that you don't have an evaluation system here in Arlington. I know there's one over in Fairfax. There's no place in the state that I'm aware of that doesn't have an evaluation model. And by the way, we have a new teacher evaluation model that was just adopted by the Board of Education and will go into effect July 1, and it does tie teachers' pay to their performance using value-added machinations, which we could debate all night. And with all due respect, the comparison of the United States to other countries, it's very convenient given that many of the other countries that have been highlighted have a much more homogeneous population, don't have the huge variances in poverty that we have in this country that everybody wants to ignore while they hold teachers accountable for what they don't have any choice in.
Let me just add briefly, I was having a conversation with a principal recently on this theme of, what can we take away and what don't we have enough time for? She said, I don't have enough time to go into classrooms and observe my teachers so that I can properly evaluate them and help them, not just evaluate them, but work with them, not doing a formal evaluation, but give them the feedback that they need so that they can improve their practice as they go along. Because we've got all these other things going on. And as I mentioned, the state last year passed this law that school boards have to have a policy that includes student achievement as part of a teacher evaluation system. It's easy for them to say that, we are spending a lot of time thinking, how do we do this so it's meaningful, so we're actually improving teacher quality and helping good teachers become better, helping teachers more in the middle, like others were saying, improve, and for those who shouldn't be in teaching so that they move on to something else. But that is not an easy thing to do.
If a principal...
Okay, hold on.
I'm sorry.
No, just hold on one second. We didn't, hold on.
I've got this...
No, you don't. No, you don't. Please, hold on. So we have 7 or 8 minutes to speak. Mike has been kind enough to extend us. I'm going to go to Emma Violon-Sanchez for a question, comment. I'm going to ask everyone to keep their questions, comments fairly brief.
I think that in Virginia or in Arlington, one of the things, we have an achievement gap. And all of us agree, I think, in this table, that we have to address the achievement gap. And we have to start in Virginia recognizing that students that speak other languages, it's an asset. So the more we focus, and I haven't heard that, if we only focus on the deficit model, and I agree with you about poverty, but we cannot use poverty as an excuse.
I'm suggesting that we should.
Okay. Questions? Daniel.
Yes. Basically, my question involves an equity and disparity population that I have not heard brought up in today's conversation. Actually, some of you may have seen in the headlines today that there was new data out about the use of seclusion and restraint in schools, and that students with disabilities were and minorities were disproportionately the recipients of such discipline. Second point is that traditionally the numbers on people serving on charter schools serving students with disabilities have been very poor. So my question to the panel is how do you suggest that we start to bring kids with disabilities into the conversation and address their issues?
Okay, thanks. I think the best thing to do is to take another couple of questions, then go down and have people respond to all of them in turn. Charlie, and then this gentleman.
Well, the one question I just wanted to ask maybe to Abby and Kitty is the concept of the use of instructional assistants for the teachers in the classroom. I know it's money's involved with that, but in a perfect world. But also the idea of maybe starting the school day an hour later. You know, you get these kids that come into school kind of fish-faced, and they're still waking up, and maybe they just had breakfast, and then they sit down, and you want them to do math or English, and they're like, I'm just waking up.
Sir.
Well, my concern is, I grew up, my father was an elementary principal. If an elementary principal can't get into the classrooms of all of his or her classes every day, there's a problem there. There's an issue there. The principal should be able to see how the teachers are acting, how they're doing every day in every classroom. Maybe not every day, but at least once or twice, 3 times a week, they should be able to judge how the teachers are doing. That's the principal's job. And if that's not happening in Arlington, that concerns me.
Okay, so let's do a wrap up with everyone starting with Dimitri, and that'll be it.
No way to answer all those questions in that amount of time. They're too complicated. Just broadly, I agree. We need to focus on diverse instructional models that can encourage people with disabilities and people with special abilities and people from all backgrounds. We should have differences in school days, longer school years. Principals should be involved in evaluations. All that needs to happen. Again, I would just anchor it back to, you can't solve the problem that was identified. And by the way, I agree with Dr. Boitnott that, and with Abby, that the constraints and the bureaucratic constraints on teachers and principals are so overwhelming that it's impossible to do the job. The question is, what do you go to from there? And you can't get rid of that command and control infrastructure without having something to replace it. And that something should be an evaluation model that is fully anchored in students.
So, yeah, great questions. Any one of them could be a whole panel. So, just a couple of quick sort of random thoughts on them. Your point on students speaking different languages and so forth is spot on. Let me just offer 2 examples to kind of illustrate. I mean, one, I'm concerned, Arlington actually has a very good adult education program, even start program. Some of that stuff's on the chopping block, and that's really unfortunate. We need to make a commitment to those citizens. One example, though, when I talk about sort of urgency, so we have a lot of Hispanic students who have come into our schools around here. I actually taught ESL. There is hardly any examples of schools doing things like, for example, having back to school night during the day, because lots of kids who actually go to school with my kids, their parents work in the evenings, and so back to school night is not really a convenient thing, but instead trying to have back to school day. Those sorts of things, when you talk about urgency and sort of going the extra mile and not letting poverty be an excuse, those are the kinds of things you look for. Right now, it's kind of like, well, if you can't make back to school night, well, maybe those parents just aren't so engaged. When in fact, they're very engaged, they just have lots of things going on in their lives, so that kind of urgency. On special ed and the seclusion, there's a whole bunch of issues. The one thing I'd say is very clearly, the best way to reduce kids in special education is to teach them to read. The research is crystal clear on this, that over half of the kids who are in special ed are there for sort of non-specific learning disabilities, which is basically a teaching disability. They haven't been taught well to read. If we actually had a serious, coherent early childhood system in the state with real standards and real access for low-income kids, we got more serious about reading in the early grades, you'd see special ed referrals go down. Now, that doesn't talk about the seclusion issue and behavioral issues, but what it means is with the kids in special ed, we'd be able to focus on them that much more than we do now. The program's diluted right now with a lot of kids who don't necessarily need to be in it. And then finally, just on this creativity point, I agree on the start time issue. Like, there's all kinds of things you can do here. Albemarle County in Virginia, you don't have to go to like other countries to see this. Albemarle County, 2 hours south of here, where UVA is, the little kids go to school early, the big kids go to school late. That's based on the research, right? The big kids need more sleep and so forth. And we know keeping them in school late is good too, because that's when they're going to get in mischief. Particularly kids who aren't playing sports and doing extracurriculars, so having them in school later in the afternoon is a good idea. I mean, this is common sense. And that's what they do. And again, that's the kind of thing, going the extra mile and being creative. So you don't have to go, outside our borders to see sort of some examples of how to solve these problems.
Yeah, with regard to the start time, more often than not, the school's start time is determined by the transportation needs as opposed to the needs of the students.
It's all about the kids.
And it should be all about the kids. It absolutely should be all about the kids. But the only thing I'd like to say as a wrap-up is that, and I didn't mention this as much in my earlier comments, but it's come to mind as I've listened to the debate tonight. The most troubling aspect of this entire debate around teacher evaluation, teacher reform, teacher accountability is that we're starting, it seems to me, from a basic assumption that most teachers are inferior and somehow need to be fired because that's the simple way to do it. That's certainly what the continuing contract bill that the governor's put forward and is up for a vote tomorrow is all about. It's about firing teachers without giving them a reason or offering any kind of rationale. That's not what we should be about. We should be about offering support for teachers. Nobody went into teaching in order to become rich, but certainly most of us went into teaching because we thought it was a respected profession. Somehow in the last 30 years, it's no longer a respected profession. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of dedicated, committed, caring teachers in our classrooms every single day. And it is a stab to their heart every time they hear anybody in front of a microphone and a TV camera talking about how bad education in Virginia is, or in the country. The rhetoric is not helpful, And I fear that we're going to find a day when we don't have anybody who wants to teach because it's just too hard, too demoralizing, and too heartbreaking to want to do.
I think for students with disabilities, one of the most important things that we can do to help their achievement is to be honest about the data. And we disaggregate data in Arlington and across the state, but we sometimes leave out students with disabilities, and that's not always as prominent. So that's a focus we've had over the last years to make sure that as we're looking at the data, we include that. And, you know, it's not so good. That's an area where we definitely need to improve and focus. And I think generally, you know, putting the data out there, we are achieving very well in a lot of areas, but like Emma said, we definitely have an achievement gap, and we need to keep working on it. We've done really well, and it's narrowed, but we sort of hit a plateau for the last couple of years, and it's how do you move forward from here and continue to narrow that gap? And those are the really hard questions that we're working on. But I think just shining a light on the data, being honest about it, comparing yourself to other jurisdictions, that's something we've done, benchmarked ourselves against other jurisdictions, and being committed to continuous improvement, not being content with where you are, but knowing that you can always do better and have that sense of urgency to do that is what we're trying to do in Arlington.
I want to thank this really tremendous panel. I think everyone would agree that it's been a privilege to hear this debate. For Democrats, these debates on these core ideas is healthy and it's good. It's a fundamental good to have the most cutting edge ideas played against one another, and they will ultimately yield a better approach that will meet the urgency of this challenge. And I've heard very specific ideas from administrator support and training on helping administrators, principals, and vice principals do their jobs even better. From questioning and reforming evaluation models, to reforming the school day, to letting teachers teach. Those are all fresh ideas that do come out of some consensus that we have heard here today. It's a critical issue. People have very strong opinions. It's one that's core to our hearts, but this kind of debate is probably where we ought to be. So I want to thank you all so much for your generosity. Thank you all.